I helped a stranger pay for groceries when he was $10 short. He said thank you and left. But the next day I got a text from an unknown number. Check your mailbox. Inside was an envelope with a check for $33 million. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always said I was the kind of woman who blended into the background. Not in a sad way, just in a quiet, unremarkable way. I was Sarah Mitchell, 43 years old, a school librarian at Jefferson Elementary in Columbus, Ohio. I drove a 2014 Honda Civic with a cracked side mirror that I kept meaning to fix. I ate lunch at my desk most days. I watered my 2 houseplants every Sunday and considered it a social event. My life had a rhythm to it. Steady, predictable, a little lonely since my divorce 4 years ago, but mine. And I had made peace with mine. The divorce from Greg had cleaned me out. Not financially so much as emotionally. We had split the house, split the savings, split the years. I walked away with enough to rent a small 2-bedroom on Elmwood Avenue and enough dignity to not hate him outright. We just weren't the same people anymore. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was messier, the way truths always are. But I had learned to let the mess live in its corner without picking at it. I wasn't struggling. That's important to say. I paid my bills on time. I had a small retirement account. I bought generic cereal and name-brand coffee because some principles are non-negotiable. I wasn't wealthy, but I was stable. I had built a careful, modest life, and I respected it, even when it felt too small for the person I thought I used to be. It was a Thursday in October when everything changed. The air had that particular sharpness that Ohio gets in fall, the kind that smells like dried leaves and something ending. I stopped at the Kroger on 5th Avenue after work, still wearing my lanyard with my school ID badge, still thinking about whether the 3rd graders had actually returned the books they'd checked out or just hidden them behind the encyclopedias again. My cart was ordinary. Pasta, a rotisserie chicken, 2 cans of chickpeas, yogurt, a bottle of Merlot that was on sale, $41.17 at the register. I remember the exact number because I was watching the screen, the way you do when you're keeping a running tally in your head. The man in front of me was old, 70-something, maybe older, with the kind of face that has stopped caring about what it looks like and achieved something better, dignity. He wore a plain gray coat, slightly too large for his frame, and he was buying almost nothing. A carton of soup, a small loaf of bread, a bottle of orange juice. The cashier, a young woman named Brianna, according to her name tag, told him his total was $19.42. He reached into his coat pocket. I watched him count the bills. Once, twice. His hands were steady but slow, the hands of a man who had learned patience the hard way. "I'm $9 short," he said. His voice was quiet and without embarrassment, which struck me. Most people would flush with shame in that moment. He simply stated a fact. Brianna looked at the line behind him. There were 3 of us. With that particular expression that cashiers get when they're about to have a problem. I didn't think. That's the truth. There was no heroism in it, no calculation. I just reached forward and held out a $10 bill. "Please," I said, "take it." He turned and looked at me. His eyes were very blue, very clear, the kind of clear that can feel either kind or cold depending on the light. In that moment, they were kind. "Thank you," he said simply. He took the bill. He paid. He collected his small bag of groceries, tucked it under his arm, and walked out of the store without looking back. I didn't think anything of it. I paid for my own things, drove home, opened the Merlot, and ate my rotisserie chicken at the kitchen table while reading about the history of the Library of Alexandria, because that was exactly the kind of Thursday evening I had. I forgot about him completely. That is the honest truth. The next morning, a Friday, I was running late. I had overslept by 20 minutes, which sent the entire morning routine into chaos. Wrong coffee ratio, forgot my travel mug, left without my umbrella even though the sky was the color of a bruise. I was halfway to my car when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. Check your mailbox. 3 words. No name. No context. I stood on my driveway staring at the screen. My first instinct was scam, some kind of phishing attempt or a wrong number. I nearly kept walking. But something stopped me. Some small, inexplicable instinct that I have since learned to trust. I walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. Inside was my usual assortment of junk. A grocery circular, an electric bill, a catalog for outdoor furniture I had never ordered from. And underneath all of it, a plain white envelope with no return address. My name handwritten on the front. Sarah Mitchell. Clean, deliberate letters. My hands were steady when I opened it. They didn't shake until I saw what was inside. A personal check. Made out to Sarah Mitchell, signed by Edward Whitmore, in the amount of $33 million. I stood there in the cold October air, in my school librarian cardigan, holding a check for $33 million, and the only thought I had, the only coherent thought my brain could form, was, this cannot be real. But the check looked real. The paper had weight to it. The ink was sharp. The routing numbers were printed at the bottom in that particular bank font that doesn't come from a home printer. I put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my purse, and I drove to work. I taught myself to function through shock a long time ago. During my divorce, during my mother's illness, during the year I worked 2 jobs and told everyone I was fine because saying otherwise felt like collapse. So I went to work that Friday on autopilot, checked in books, helped a 2nd grader find a story about penguins, argued mildly with a 4th grade teacher about overdue fines, all while a white envelope sat in my purse in my desk drawer like a small, impossible bomb. It wasn't until my lunch break, alone in the break room with a cup of coffee I didn't taste, that I allowed myself to actually look at the check again. I unfolded it carefully on the table in front of me, smoothing the crease. The paper was high quality, thick, with a faint watermark, the kind of check that isn't printed at an office supply store. The bank name printed at the top was Whitmore Private Bank, N.A., a name I didn't recognize, which felt significant somehow. The memo line was blank. The signature was confident and unhurried, Edward Whitmore. $33 million, .00. $33 million and 0 cents. My hands started shaking then. Not from fear, not entirely. From the sudden, vertiginous awareness that something had shifted in the world and I hadn't been warned. I thought about the man from the grocery store, the gray coat, the quiet voice, the blue eyes. Thank you. He had said it like a man who knew the weight of words and chose them carefully. And then he had left. No lingering, no explanation, no indication that he was anything other than an elderly man short on grocery money. Could someone who needed a $10 loan at the Kroger write a check for $33 million? The question felt absurd, and yet the check existed. It sat on the break room table in front of me, entirely real, entirely impossible. I put it away before anyone came in. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and made a list. It's what I do when I don't know what to do. I make lists. It gives the chaos a container. At the top I wrote, What do I know? Below it, point by point, I helped a stranger. He said thank you and left. Someone texted me from an unknown number. An envelope arrived with a check from Edward Whitmore. I do not know who Edward Whitmore is. Then I opened my laptop. Edward Whitmore was not a difficult man to find once you knew to look. He was 79 years old, a reclusive industrialist who had built a significant fortune in logistics and cold chain supply infrastructure, refrigerated transport, warehousing, pharmaceutical distribution. Not a household name, not the kind of billionaire who gave TED Talks or put his name on buildings. The kind who existed quietly, enormously, in the spaces between public attention. He had been married once. His wife, Margaret, had died 11 years earlier. They had no children. His only living relatives, according to a 2-year-old article in a Columbus business journal, were a nephew named Victor Whitmore and Victor's wife, Diana. I read that paragraph 3 times. Victor and Diana Whitmore. The article described Victor as the presumed heir to the Whitmore estate, with Diana quoted as having closely supported her uncle-in-law's philanthropic endeavors. There was a photograph. Victor was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with the practiced smile of a man who had learned to perform warmth rather than feel it. Diana stood beside him in a blazer the color of expensive things, one hand on Victor's arm, the other holding a wine glass, her expression pleasant and watchful at the same time. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark of my kitchen for a long time. Here was the thing I had to decide. Was this check a genuine gift, the act of an old man who had been moved by a small kindness and chosen to respond with an enormous one? Or was it a mistake? A test? A mistake that would bring consequences when discovered? And underneath all of those questions, a quieter one. What happens when Victor Whitmore finds out? Because if Edward had no children and Victor was the presumed heir, then $33 million redirected to a school librarian from Columbus was not going to go unnoticed. It was not going to be accepted gracefully. I knew that with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with human nature. I had watched enough people lose things to understand how they behave when they believe something is theirs. My plan, when it came to me, was not dramatic. It was the plan of a woman who has learned to be careful, to move quietly, to do things correctly the first time so they don't need to be done twice. I was not going to rush. I was not going to tell anyone. I was going to find a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but the right kind. And I was going to understand exactly what I was holding before I did a single thing with it. I was going to be smart. That was the plan. Just be smart. I wrote it on the legal pad, underlined it twice, and went to bed. I didn't sleep much, but I had a direction. Saturday morning, I drove 40 minutes to a lawyer's office in Dublin, Ohio, specifically because I didn't want to use anyone in Columbus who might know someone who knew someone. That's the kind of thinking I had already started doing. Lateral, careful, slightly paranoid. I told myself it was just prudence. I had spent Friday night researching estate attorneys, reading bar association reviews, cross-referencing names until I settled on James Holloway, a 60-year-old man with a reputation for meticulous, unshowy work and a client list that skewed toward quietly wealthy rather than publicly flashy. His office was on the second floor of a nondescript professional building, above a physical therapy clinic, with a waiting room that smelled like coffee and old carpet. He saw me at 10 o'clock. He was shorter than his photo suggested, with reading glasses perched on his nose, and the careful attention of a man who made his living listening to what people didn't say as much as what they did. I placed the check on his desk without preamble. He picked it up, read it, put it down, read it again. Then he looked at me over the glasses. "Tell me exactly how this came into your possession," he said. I told him. All of it. The grocery store, the $10, the text message, the envelope. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way that professional thinkers are quiet. Not emptily, but usefully. "Is the check valid?" I asked. "That's what we're going to find out," he said. "But I can tell you this. The paper, the formatting, the bank imprint. This is not a forgery. This is the real instrument. Whether there are sufficient funds, whether it was written under sound mind and voluntarily, whether it can be contested, those are different questions." He paused. "You said his name is Edward Whitmore." "Yes." He typed something on his computer. Then he looked at me with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Sarah," he said, "Edward Whitmore passed away Wednesday morning, 3 days ago." The room went very still. The day before, I found the check. He had written it before he died. Somehow, he had known my name, known my address, arranged for it to be delivered. The check was dated the Tuesday before his death. He had been deliberate. He had known exactly what he was doing. "He was my client," James said quietly. "Not recently. We worked together perhaps 12 years ago on a property matter, but I know who he was, and I can tell you, without violating anything, that Edward Whitmore was one of the most deliberate people I have ever encountered. He did not do things accidentally." He took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "This is going to be contested," he said. "You understand that?" "Victor Whitmore," I said. He looked at me carefully. "You've done your research." "A little." "Then you know what you're stepping into." He wasn't warning me away. He was simply making sure I was walking in with my eyes open. There is a difference, and I appreciated the distinction. The estate is substantial. Victor has been positioned as the presumptive heir for years. A $33 million check, hand-delivered after death to a stranger, will be challenged aggressively. What do I need to do? He folded his hands on the desk. "First, say nothing to no one, not a word, not to friends, not to family. Second, we verify the check through proper channels. I have a banking contact who can confirm the account standing quietly. Third, we find out whether Edward left a will and whether this check is consistent with or contradicts its terms. The will, if it exists, was likely filed with probate this week." He leaned forward slightly. "And if you're asking me whether I'll represent you, yes, I will. Because from what you've described, this man made a choice, and choices made with a clear mind deserve to be honored." I drove home feeling something I hadn't expected. Not excitement, not fear, but a kind of solemn gravity. The weight of being chosen for something without asking to be. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that I had already been noticed. The following Monday, I returned to work to find a voicemail on my desk phone. Not my cell phone, my work phone, the one whose number wasn't publicly listed. A woman's voice, smooth and practiced. "This is Diana Whitmore. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance. I'd love to speak with you at your earliest convenience." She left a number. She knew where I worked. She knew my name. She'd found me in less than 72 hours. How? I asked myself that question with a cold, clear focus. The text message, whoever had sent me to the mailbox had known my address and my phone number. Someone in Edward's circle, someone who had helped facilitate the delivery. Had that person also told the Whitmores? Or had they found me another way, through the bank, through probate records, through some connection I couldn't see yet? I did not return Diana's call. I called James Holloway instead. "They found me," I said. A brief pause. "Then we move faster," he said. "I'll call you tonight." There was no going back now. I understood that completely. The moment Diana Whitmore left that voicemail, the story stopped being only mine. James moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had handled contested estates before and had no illusions about how ugly they could become. By Wednesday of the following week, we'd confirmed 3 critical facts. The Whitmore account held sufficient funds. Edward had filed a new will with a Columbus probate court 11 days before his death. And in that will, a handwritten codicil as witnessed and notarized specified a bequest of $33 million to Sarah Ellen Mitchell of Columbus, Ohio, in gratitude for a grace I did not expect and cannot repay. He had written my full name. He had known it before we ever spoke. I spent a long time thinking about that, how he had found me, why he had come to that particular Kroger on that particular Thursday. James suggested it might not have been coincidence, that Edward, knowing he was dying, may have gone looking for a reason to believe in people, may have manufactured the encounter deliberately. I didn't know whether to find that comforting or heartbreaking, so I held both feelings at once and kept moving. The codicil was legal. James was certain. It had been prepared by Edward's own attorney, a man named Gerald Foss who had served him for 20 years and who, James told me carefully, had already indicated he would not obstruct probate. Victor and Diana Whitmore filed an objection within 4 days of the will entering probate. It was expected. What was not expected was what came next. On a Thursday evening, exactly 2 weeks after the grocery store, I pulled into my driveway to find a black SUV parked at the curb. Victor Whitmore was standing beside it. He was larger in person than his photographs suggested. The practiced smile was present but thinner, like it was being maintained at some cost. Diana stood a step behind him, wearing a coat the color of winter, her expression calibrated into something that was meant to look like concern. "Ms. Mitchell," Victor said, "I'm sorry to just show up like this. I hope you understand. This is a very emotional time for our family." I stood by my car door and looked at him. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, and meant it plainly without weaponizing it. "Thank you." He nodded. "We'd just like to talk, privately, woman to woman in a sense." He glanced at Diana, who stepped forward, and I noticed how choreographed it was, the way they had clearly rehearsed who spoke when. "Sarah," Diana said, and the use of my first name without permission was not accidental. "We believe our uncle may not have been entirely well in his final weeks. His physician has expressed concerns about his mental state." "His physician will testify under oath," I said. "That's a matter for the court." A flicker crossed Victor's face. Not anger yet. Something earlier than anger. Recalculation. "We're prepared to offer you a settlement," he said. $500,000. Cleared within 30 days. No court, no media, no complications. You walk away with more money than most people see in a lifetime, and you don't have to deal with any of this. He gestured vaguely at the air around us, as though the legal process were a weather event. $500,000. The number was designed to feel large. And standing in my driveway, in my librarian cardigan, part of me understood the pull of it, the simplicity of yes, the relief of finished. That part of me was tired and had been tired for a long time. But I thought of Edward Whitmore, writing my name in his careful hand, a grace I did not expect. He hadn't given me the money because I was convenient. He had given it because he wanted it to mean something. "No," I said. Victor's smile didn't move, but his eyes changed. "You should think carefully." "I have," I said. "Good night." I went inside and locked the door. I stood in my hallway for a full minute, not moving, listening to the sound of the SUV driving away. Then I sat down on the floor, not dramatically, just because my legs suggested it, and breathed. The next morning, I called James with the full account. He responded with the measured satisfaction of a man whose predictions had been confirmed. He filed a formal notice with the court that opposing parties had made direct contact with his client, which was already professionally questionable given that I was represented. It wasn't enough to sanction them, but it was a documented fact. Facts accumulate. That was James's philosophy, and I was learning to make it mine. After that, I took 4 days off from everything that wasn't necessary. I drove to my sister's house in Dayton, Carroll, who didn't know about any of it yet, who fed me soup and made me watch 2 terrible romantic comedies and ask no probing questions because she has always understood when I needed to be a person rather than a problem. I slept 8 hours a night. I walked in the park near her house every morning in the cold. I let myself be ordinary for 4 days. On the 5th day, I drove back to Columbus. I was ready. The temptation, when it came, arrived through a medium I hadn't anticipated: email. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the probate process. The message came from an address I didn't recognize, to my personal email account, not my work address, which told me immediately that someone had done their research. The email was 3 paragraphs long, professionally written, and introduced its sender as a representative of a foundation called the Whitmore Family Legacy Trust, an entity I'd never heard of before, and which James later confirmed had been incorporated 11 days prior. Its existence, in other words, was recent enough to be suspicious. The offer was different this time. Not money exactly, or not only money. The foundation, the email explained, was planning to establish a significant educational endowment in Edward Whitmore's memory. They were looking for community partners, educators, individuals with standing in the local school community who might serve in an advisory capacity. The role would come with a generous annual stipend, $250,000 per year, full benefits, a title, and public recognition. We believe, the email concluded, that someone with your background and community roots would be an ideal representative of Mr. Whitmore's values. I read it twice, slowly. Then I printed it and put it in the folder I'd started keeping for exactly this kind of thing. What was it designed to do? Several things at once, and I gave Victor and Diana credit for the sophistication of it. It offered money through a different channel, not a buyout, but an ongoing income, which was psychologically harder to refuse. It offered identity, a title, recognition, standing. It offered me a version of myself that felt legitimate, earned, deserved. It asked nothing explicitly in return, which was precisely how it communicated its ask. Drop the check, accept this instead, call it honoring Edward's legacy. I felt the pull of it. I will not pretend otherwise. $250,000 a year, a title, a reason to matter in a different way. These things speak to something real in a person. The part of me that had spent 4 years being quietly diminished after my divorce, the part that had made peace with a life that was fine but never quite large enough, that part heard the offer and considered it. But I also knew what it was. A gilded cage is still a cage. The moment I accepted, I became theirs. A managed narrative. A woman who could be pointed at as proof of Victor's generosity, while he absorbed the rest of the estate unchallenged. And I would have to live inside that arrangement, grateful and contained, for as long as they found me useful. I forwarded the email to James. He added it to the court file as evidence of continued improper contact and possible witness tampering. The foundation, as it turned out, had no assets, no registered officers beyond a shell address in Delaware, and no discernible purpose beyond this moment. It dissolved 18 days later, quietly, the way things do when they stop being useful. I did not respond to the email. What I did instead was tell the truth, carefully, selectively, to one person. Her name was Karen Ose, and she had been my closest friend since graduate school, a woman who had spent 30 years as a social worker and had therefore developed an immunity to shock that I found deeply comforting. We met for coffee at a place in Clintonville on a Wednesday evening, a booth in the back, and I told her everything, from the grocery store to the check to Victor and Diana to the foundation email, while she sat across from me and drank her coffee and listened with the particular stillness of someone who knows how to hold what they're told. When I finished, she set her cup down. "First question," she said. "Do you trust the lawyer?" "Yes." "Good. Second question. Have you told anyone else?" "No, just you." She nodded slowly. "Then here's what I think. You were chosen. Not by accident, not randomly. You were chosen. And the people trying to take this from you are scared of exactly that. Because if the court believes it, and it sounds like the paperwork is solid, they lose everything they thought was already theirs." She paused. "They're not fighting for their uncle's legacy. They're fighting for an inheritance they mentally spent years ago." She was right. That was the cleanest truth I'd heard spoken about the whole situation, and hearing it out loud shifted something in me, turned the abstract pressure of the legal process into something I could grip. Karen didn't offer to fix anything. She offered to be present, which was what I needed. She became the person I called on the days when the stress accumulated past the point I could carry alone. She drove with me to 2 of my meetings with James. She sat in the parking lot of the courthouse on the day the first probate hearing was scheduled, because I hadn't asked her to, and she came anyway. That is what support looks like when it is real. Not loud, not performative, not contingent on anything, just present. I went home that Wednesday night steadier than I had been in weeks. The house on Elmwood Avenue felt different than it had a month ago, not smaller, but correctly sized. I was the same woman, but I was no longer the woman who could be outweighted or outspent into giving up. They came on a Saturday afternoon, 5 weeks into the probate proceedings, when the leaves had fully fallen and the street outside was the color of old pewter. I saw Diana's car, a charcoal Mercedes, through the front window before she knocked. I watched it for a moment, long enough to understand this was not going to be the same conversation as the driveway. I opened the door because turning them away without hearing them would feel like fear, and I had decided I was done performing fear for their benefit. Diana was alone this time. That was the first departure from pattern. She stood on my porch holding a dish covered in foil, her expression arranged into something that might have read as warmth if you hadn't seen the other version of her face. "I made a chicken casserole," she said. "I know this has been a hard few weeks for everyone. I just wanted to come as a neighbor, a person, not as anything official." I held the door open. "Come in," I said. We sat at my kitchen table, the casserole between us like a prop we'd both agreed not to quite believe in. Diana folded her hands and sighed in the practiced way of someone who has rehearsed their vulnerability. She talked about Edward, how much the family had loved him, how difficult his decline had been, how they had sacrificed their own lives to support him in his final years. Victor, she said, had personally managed Edward's affairs for nearly 3 years, had driven him to medical appointments, handled his finances, coordinated his care. "We loved him," she said, and her voice was calibrated perfectly, just short of tears. I listened. I let her speak. There is information in what people choose to say when they want something from you, and I had learned, over the past month, to collect information the way James collected documents, without reacting, without giving away the shape of what I knew. Then she shifted. "Sarah." She met my eyes. "I want to speak to you honestly, woman to woman. Victor and I, we're not monsters. We understand that Edward was a complicated man who made a complicated decision. But you have to understand what this is doing to us. This is our family. This is our inheritance. Something we planned around, sacrificed for. Something Edward promised us over years of conversations." She paused, and then he gives $33 million to someone he met in a grocery store. She let that sit for a moment. The implication was clear. You know it's not right. You know this was a confused old man. You know you don't belong in this story. "We're prepared to increase our offer," she said. $1.2 million, cleared without litigation, no public record. You can keep your job, your life, your reputation. You walk away with more than you could ever reasonably. "Diana," I said quietly. She stopped. "I want to ask you something." I kept my voice even. In 3 years of helping Edward manage his affairs, did you ever accompany him to a Kroger on a Thursday afternoon? Something moved across her face, just briefly. "I don't understand the relevance." "He went alone," I said. "He chose to be alone. And he was short $10, and I gave them to him, and he said thank you, and that was the whole thing. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he had money. I gave $10 to an old man because it was the right thing to do in that moment." I leaned forward slightly, and he remembered that. He decided that mattered, and I'm not going to dishonor that decision because it's inconvenient for you. Diana's expression changed. Not dramatically. She was too controlled for drama. But the warmth dissolved, and underneath it was something colder and more honest. "You're making a serious mistake," she said. "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to make." She stood, picked up her casserole dish, and then said the thing she had been building toward all along. "Victor has friends. In the banking community, in the local media. We've been patient, Sarah. We've tried to be generous. But if you insist on pursuing this—" She let the sentence end there, unfinished, like a door left open to show you what's on the other side. I stood up too. I walked to my front door and opened it. After she left, I stood in my hallway and felt it. The fear. Clear and cold, a physical thing in my chest. Victor had contacts in media. He could make this ugly publicly. He could frame me as a predatory stranger who had manipulated a dying man. He could make the story about me rather than about Edward. But underneath the fear, pressing up against it, was something harder. He could try, and I would still be right. The fear didn't go away, but I had stopped needing it to. It had become, instead, a kind of fuel. The feeling of knowing exactly what was at stake and choosing to stand anyway. I called James on Monday morning and reported everything Diana had said. He listened, and then he said, "Good. Let them threaten. Documented threats are evidence." He filed a motion that afternoon. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in December, 7 weeks after I had first stood in my driveway holding an envelope I didn't understand. The courthouse in Columbus had that institutional gravity that government buildings accumulate over decades. High ceilings, worn marble floors, the smell of paper and consequence. I arrived 20 minutes early with James at my side, wearing the navy blazer I'd bought specifically because it said, "I take this seriously," without saying, "I am afraid." Karen sat 3 rows behind me. I had not asked her to come. She had simply texted Sunday evening. What time should I be there? Victor and Diana arrived with 2 attorneys, one a Columbus-based estate litigator, the other a specialist apparently flown in from Chicago. The size of their legal team was meant to communicate something. I had been noticing over the past weeks how much of Victor's strategy was communicative rather than substantive. The SUV in the driveway, the foundation email, Diana's casserole, all of it designed to make me feel outweighed before the actual fight began. I had stopped being impressed by it. The hearing opened with procedural arguments, challenges to the codicil's validity, questions about the chain of custody of the will, an assertion that Edward had been experiencing cognitive decline sufficient to impair his judgment. Their Chicago attorney presented an affidavit from a physician, not Edward's primary doctor, but a specialist he had seen once, 14 months earlier, citing notes about occasional memory inconsistencies. James presented 3 things in response. The first was a letter from Edward's primary physician of 12 years, Dr. Patricia Okafor, stating unequivocally that Edward Whitmore had been cognitively sharp, emotionally oriented, and fully competent to make financial and legal decisions in the 2 months prior to his death. The letter was precise, clinical, and entirely clear. The second was the testimony of Gerald Foss, Edward's longtime attorney, who had witnessed the codicil personally. Foss was 71 years old and had the particular authority of a man who has nothing to prove. He described the session calmly. Edward had arrived at his office on a specific Tuesday morning, had dictated the addition to his will, had reviewed it, had signed it in Foss's presence and the presence of 2 witnesses, and had said, Foss quoted him directly, "I want it to be clear that this is the clearest decision I have made in a long time." The Chicago attorney attempted to suggest that Foss had been unduly influenced. Foss looked at him for a moment before responding. "I have been practicing law for 41 years, he said. "I know what undue influence looks like. This was not it." But the third item was the one that changed the room. James had spent the past 6 weeks quietly documenting the Whitmore family's behavior since Edward's death. Not the offers to me, though those were included, but a pattern of financial decisions made by Victor in the weeks before Edward died. Specifically, Victor, as power of attorney over Edward's day-to-day accounts, had transferred $800,000 from a Whitmore account into a jointly held account with his wife in the 10 days before the codicil was filed. Edward had noticed. He had mentioned it to Foss during the same meeting where the codicil was written. His exact words, which Foss had noted and which James now read into the record, "Victor has already begun helping himself. I would like to make a different decision." The courtroom was not loud. It wasn't a dramatic silence exactly, more like the particular quiet that settles when everyone in a room has just understood the same thing at the same time. Victor's lead attorney asked for a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. In the hallway, I sat on a wooden bench, and James sat beside me, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "He knew," I said. "Yes," James said. "He went to that grocery store on purpose." "I believe so." James looked at his notes rather than at me. "I think he went looking for evidence that ordinary decency still existed, and he found it." I thought about an old man in a gray coat, counting his bills. Was it a test? Was it loneliness? Was it something stranger and more deliberate than either? I would never know with certainty. But he had written my name in his will, and a jury of strangers was being asked to decide whether that name belonged there. And I thought, for the first time with complete certainty, that it did. When court resumed, the judge had questions for Victor's team about the $800,000 transfer. The Chicago attorney stumbled twice. Victor, sitting at the opposing table, had lost the easy confidence of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. He answered questions about the transfer with the halting precision of someone speaking carefully to avoid a trap, which is exactly what you do when there is a trap. Diana, seated in the gallery, showed nothing, but she held very still, in the way of someone who has stopped performing and is now simply waiting. James leaned toward me at the close of the session and said quietly, "They've lost the narrative. That's what matters today." The judge took the matter under advisement. We were told a decision would come within 30 days. I walked out into the December cold with Karen and James, and the city was gray and bright at once, and I was not afraid. The judge's decision arrived on a Thursday, 26 days after the hearing, delivered not dramatically, but in the way legal decisions actually come. A notification to James's office that a ruling had been filed. He called me at 2:17 in the afternoon. "The bequest stands," he said, "in full. The codicil has been validated. There was no evidence of undue influence, and the challenge was dismissed." I was sitting at my desk at Jefferson Elementary when he called. I had a cup of coffee in my hand and a stack of third-grade book reports in front of me, and the ordinary afternoon light coming through the window, and I said, "Thank you, James." And then I sat there for a moment, holding the phone against my chest. It was real. It had always been real, but now it was decided real. Sanctioned by law, resistant to reversal, mine. The probate process took another 6 weeks to fully clear, but from the ruling forward, the outcome was not in question. James worked efficiently through the remaining administrative steps. I opened a new private banking account at the recommendation of a financial advisor James referred me to, a woman named Patricia Hale, who specialized in sudden wealth situations and who, in our first meeting, handed me a book about the psychological impact of unexpected financial change and said, "Read this before you make any decisions." I liked her immediately. Victor and Diana's legal challenge was not only dismissed, but examined. The $800,000 transfer that James had surfaced became a separate matter, one that the court referred to a fiduciary review process. James explained this to me in careful terms. It did not necessarily mean criminal proceedings, but it meant scrutiny, official, documented, consequential scrutiny. Victor had exercised power of attorney over Edward's accounts and had moved money in a direction that benefited himself without Edward's documented consent. The fact that this had occurred in the weeks directly before Edward changed his will was not, the court noted, coincidental in appearance. Victor hired a third attorney to handle that matter separately from the estate challenge. The two legal processes had different timelines, different fees, different implications, but they were connected by the same thread. A man who had spent years assuming an inheritance was already his and had behaved accordingly. On the Friday the funds were formally released to my account, I went home and ordered a pizza. I did not call anyone. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had unfolded the check for the first time, where I had made my lists, where Diana had sat with her casserole in her carefully calibrated warmth. And I ate 2 slices and drank a glass of the good wine I had been saving for no particular reason, except that it felt like a significant event kind of bottle. This was significant. This was the event. I did not feel, as I might have expected, euphoric. what I felt was something steadier and deeper than euphoria. A kind of alignment, as though something that had been slightly off-axis in my life had been corrected. Not because of the money itself, though the money was real and transformative, and I did not pretend otherwise, but because a dying man had decided I was worth $33 million on the basis of $10 and a moment of ordinary human decency, and the system, creaking and slow and imperfect as it is, had agreed with him. That mattered in a way that was hard to put into words without sounding sentimental, so I didn't try. I just sat with it, alone, in my kitchen, in the house on Elmwood Avenue, and let it be what it was. Victor Whitmore's name appeared in the Columbus Dispatch 6 months later in an article about the fiduciary review that had grown into a formal investigation by the Ohio Department of Commerce. He and Diana had retained separate attorneys by that point, which is itself a particular kind of ending, the moment when two people who built a strategy together realize they each need their own defense. The article was brief and factual and mentioned the original estate challenge only in passing as context. I did not read it with satisfaction, exactly, more with a kind of witnessing. This is what happens. Not always. The world is not reliably just, and I know that. But sometimes the thing that was taken from someone or attempted to be taken circles back. Sometimes the people who spent years positioning themselves to benefit from someone else's death find that the very deliberateness of their positioning is the thing that undoes them. Edward had known. That was the most remarkable part, the part I returned to most often in the weeks after. He had known that Victor was already helping himself. He had known what waited for his estate once he was gone. And he had chosen, in one of his final decisions, to do something different. To find a reason to believe the story didn't have to end that way. I was that reason. Not because I was extraordinary, because I was available and present and I gave $10 to a man who needed them without asking anything in return. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. The first thing I did with the money, after the financial planning, after the taxes, after the months of careful, deliberate decisions with Patricia Hale, was buy the house on Elmwood Avenue. Not a new house, my house. The rental I had lived in for 4 years, with its slightly uneven porch step and the maple tree in the back that turned the color of fire every October, and the kitchen window that looked onto the neighbor's garden. I called my landlord, who had always been decent, made him a fair offer, and he accepted. I stood on the porch the day I signed the papers and looked at the street I knew and thought, this is home. And now it actually is. I fixed the uneven porch step that same week, not because I had to, because I could, and because small things matter when they're yours. I took a leave of absence from Jefferson Elementary in the spring, not because I wanted to quit, but because I wanted to choose. There is a difference between staying somewhere because you have no other option and staying because you love it. I spent 3 months not working, which was harder than I expected and more clarifying. I traveled briefly, 2 weeks in Portugal with Karen, whose excitement about the trip was better than any landmark I saw, though the landmarks were extraordinary. I came back certain of one thing. I missed the library. I missed the kids. I missed being the person who helped a 3rd grader find a book about penguins and watch their face change when they found the right one. I went back in September, but now I also funded a reading initiative through a small foundation focused on school library resources in underfunded districts, the kind with outdated collections and no budget for new acquisitions. It wasn't dramatic philanthropy. It was specific, practical, and rooted in the thing I actually knew. Edward had wanted the money to mean something. I wanted to make sure it did. In the first year, we restocked 11 libraries across 4 counties. I visited each one. I shook hands with librarians who looked the way I must have looked for years, grateful, underfunded, and determined anyway. My sister Carol came to visit in July, and we sat on the repaired porch in the evenings. She asked me once, carefully, if I ever felt guilty for having what I had, for the way it had arrived. I thought about it honestly before I answered. No, I said, not guilty, but responsible. There was a difference there, and I tried to honor it. Victor Whitmore did not emerge from the fiduciary investigation quietly. The Ohio Department of Commerce concluded that he had misappropriated funds from Edward's accounts on 3 separate occasions over 2 years while serving as power of attorney, $1.4 million in total. The finding was referred to the county prosecutor. Victor pleaded no contest to a reduced charge, repayment of the funds, 5 years of probation, and a permanent prohibition from serving in any fiduciary capacity in Ohio. Diana filed for divorce 4 months before the plea. Whatever they had built together on the assumption of an inherited fortune had collapsed when the foundation did. Their house in Upper Arlington was listed for sale in the spring and sold below asking price. The kind of small, unglamorous detail that tells you more about a situation than the dramatic facts do. I did not follow their story closely. I found, to my own surprise, that I felt very little animus toward them. What they had tried to do was understandable, if not forgivable. They had built their lives around an expectation, and when it was removed, they had fought with every tool they had. They had simply chosen the wrong tools and ultimately the wrong story to believe. Edward had chosen a different story. He had gone to a grocery store, counted bills in front of a stranger, and waited to see what happened. I keep a photograph on my kitchen windowsill now. The view from my back porch in October, the maple tree at peak color, that brilliant, burning orange Ohio delivers as though apologizing for winter. I look at it when the foundation work is tedious or the world feels like it's running on a logic I can't follow. An old man in a gray coat needed $10. I gave them without thinking. The rest of the story wrote itself. Kindness is not a transaction. It doesn't calculate return. It doesn't ask who's watching or what it's worth. It just acts. Because the moment is there, and the person is there, and you are too. Edward Whitmore chose me because I didn't choose for a reason. So I'll ask you now, if you'd been standing behind that man in line, would you have reached for your wallet? Leave a comment. I genuinely